And hospitable and for providing this wonderful facility in the first place. Just a bit of general background for this research. I've been working on religion and the Navy for some years now, off and on. And in many respects, this was spurred by a movement among maritime historians to look more at the human dimension of seafaring, particularly naval warfare in the early 20th century, which might sound a bit obscure, but it was dominated by a technological approach that kind of cast out the human dimension. And in recovering the human dimension, historians like Ronald Spector and others have quarried the social history of the Navy, have looked at issues such as training, etc., and indeed not just the Royal Navy, but navies worldwide. And really what I wanted to do was to insert religion into this picture and to illustrate how, as a human institution, the Royal Navy was affected far more than one might realise by entrenched institutional religious cultures and indeed by the demands of religious minorities. So not an obvious choice for religious historians perhaps, but I think it's important really to illustrate just how dominant an Anglican cultural mindset was in one of Britain's foremost national institutions. And I think in order to understand this, we have to grasp the fact that 120 years ago, 110 years ago, Britain regarded itself as a Christian nation, but also preeminently as a maritime nation. So those two identities very much went together, and the religious tradition which held sway in the Royal Navy was the Anglican tradition, and in particular, the Church of England, as we'll see. So, at the turn of the 20th century, issues of religion and race lay entwined at the very heart of British sea power, their potential for controversy masked by the material and technical might of the Royal Navy. Britain saw their navy as the glory and mainstay of the empire, its ascendancy ensuring the primacy of British trade, the safety of British emigrants, and the security of Britain's possessions around the world. By comparison, the army was a poor relation, composed of inferior human material, or so it was thought, and beholden to the navy for safe passage to and from its colonial garrisons and campaigns. As the largest and most formidable navy in the world, the senior service embodied Britain's industrial power and technological ingenuity, standing as the ironclad guarantor of imperial trade, security, and prosperity. Its prestige was also reflected in its ties to the royal family. It was, after all, the Royal Navy, in which the future George V, Edward VIII, and George VI all served. And it was also evident in the lavish use of naval tropes in contemporary commercial advertising. Think of cigarette adverts of the day, etc., trading on the image of the sailor. Though both were overwhelmingly white and Christian, the Navy was more open to the recruitment of black and non-Christian personnel, a situation reflected in some subtle differences in their religious profiles. In 1913, and excluding officers, 685 Muslims were serving among 122,000 men of the Royal Navy, whereas, excluding the Indian Army and the various colonial corps as they were known, no Muslims, Hindus or Sikhs were present among the 250,000 non-commissioned officers and men of the British Army. However, this Christian hegemony did not imply the absence of ethno-religious discord, rancour that was deeply rooted in the confessional post-Reformation history of the British Isles. This paper highlights the most consequential religious and ethnic division in the Royal Navy, that which demarcated a Catholic and mainly Irish minority from an Anglican and predominantly English institution. Hence, it is a study of the obstinately Anglican character of the Navy and of the drivers, nature and significance of Irish Catholic self-assertion in the period around 1900 to the end of the First World War. Let's deal now with the phenomenon of an Anglican Navy. Historians of Anglicanism and Catholicism in the British Isles have largely overlooked their roles and rivalry in the British Armed Services of the 19th and early 20th centuries. While the reasons behind this can be conjectured, originating probably in the silos of church, military and maritime history, there can be no doubt as to the centrality of Anglicanism in their institutional cultures, or the presence of Catholics, who comprise the largest religious minority in both, as a reflection and vehicle of their integration into national life. Although the history of religion in the Royal Navy has been most neglected, as the most popular and prestigious of British institutions, by the turn of the 20th century, it was a key arena in which religious minorities could advance their own claims. It was, moreover, a quintessentially Anglican milieu, one of the last bastions of Anglican privilege after decades of retreat in Parliament, the great universities, and many other spheres of British civilian life. The place of Catholicism was, however, very different, even between the two services, a fact that even civil servants, quite apart from Catholic commentators, recognised. Throughout most of the 18th century, and under a battery of penal laws in Ireland and mainland Britain, Catholics were technically excluded from serving in the army. Indeed, common fears of how James II, Britain's last Catholic monarch, might use an expanded and increasingly Catholic standing army proved a catalyst for his overthrow in the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688-9. Nevertheless, Catholics from the British Isles maintained a strong military tradition. From the late 16th century until the American War of Independence, Catholics served in the armies of foreign powers, often, but not always, those hostile to Protestant Britain. With their recruitment technically illegal until the First Catholic Relief Act of 1778, in ensuing decades, and especially under the pressures of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, the British Army opened its ranks to English, Scottish, and especially Irish Catholic recruits. Indeed, in the first decades of the 19th century, Catholic Ireland, so long feared as a sink of popish sedition, became the British Army's principal recruiting ground. While this influenced the political atmospherics and calculations around Catholic emancipation in 1829, by the end of the 19th century, Catholics enjoyed a secure, even privileged place in the British Army. Not only were Catholic chaplains engaged and commissioned on equal terms with their Anglican and Presbyterian counterparts, but partly to counter anti-recruiting campaigns by radical Irish nationalists, Catholicism was institutionally flattered by the treatment of the Army's Irish regiments, such as the Connaught Rangers, and by the creation of the Irish Guards in 1900. All this stood in contrast to the position of Catholics in the Royal Navy, whose Anglican hegemony was doggedly maintained. For all its technical sophistication and its status as a shared source of pride in a religiously pluralistic nation, the Navy remained culturally conservative and bullishly Anglican. The Royal Navy and the resurrected Episcopal Church of England were in fact twin products of the Restoration era, and the affinity between the post-Restoration English Church and the revived Royal Navy was signalled by the construction of dockyard chapels, the episcopal licensing of naval chaplains, and the contents of the 1662 Book of Common Prayer, which, unlike previous iterations of the prayer book, included forms of prayer to be used at sea. Furthermore, the Articles of War, which governed the post-Restoration Royal Navy, commenced with strictures appertaining to the public worship of God, decreeing, among other things, that officers ensure that the public worship of God, according to the liturgy of the Church of England established by law, be solemnly, orderly, and reverently performed in their respective ships. In the 1860s, the reworking of the Articles of War into successive naval discipline acts preserved this hegemony. According to the Act of 1866, which applied for the next 90 years, all officers in command of Her Majesty's ships of war shall cause the public worship of Almighty God, according to the liturgy of the Church of England, established by law, to be solemnly, orderly, and reverently performed in their respective ships, and shall take care that prayers and preaching by chaplains in holy orders of the respective ships be performed diligently, and that the Lord's Day be observed according to law. These preoccupations were underlined in the 1913 edition of King's Regulations and Admiralty Instructions. Furthermore, over the previous 50 years, the Anglican ethos of the Navy had been buttressed in other ways. From 1859, the role of chaplain of the fleet was recast. Thereafter, he would be the senior chaplain at Greenwich Hospital and rank as a rear admiral. The Reverend William Whiting's Eternal Father Strong to Save, published in 1861, became the de facto Navy hymn, an Admiralty-approved liturgy for the launching of Royal Navy ships debuted in 1875, and the Admiralty's keenness on daily prayers informed Winston Churchill's famous outburst as First Lord that naval tradition comprised nothing but rum, sodomy, prayers, and the lash. While the expansive work of Agnes Weston's Sailors' Rests demonstrated the missionary reach of evangelical Anglicans among ratings and Marines, the pervasive cult of Nelson helped legitimise the Anglican supremacy among naval officers. Son of a Norfolk clergyman, the stellar career and simple faith of the Navy's ultimate hero showed how professional virtues were ideally anchored in a Christian paradigm of service and sacrifice. While Nelson was memorialised in Pieta-like fashion in Arthur William Davis's iconic painting The Death of Nelson, 1807, his uncomplicated piety, if not his checkered personal life, was among the sterling qualities that generations of naval officers were expected to emulate. If the issue of religious pluralism was of lesser importance in the commercial, more fragmented world of the merchant marine, the world of the warship and of the fighting sailor prized discipline and conformity in religious as in other matters. Significantly, at the turn of the 20th century, the Royal Navy was not alone in sustaining and promoting a dominant religious culture. In the United States Navy, which was culturally beholden to its British counterpart, the Protestant Episcopal Church, a comparatively small daughter church of the Church of England and Scottish Episcopal Church, held sway in its wardrooms, and America's leading naval strategist at the turn of the 20th century, Alfred Thayer Mahon, was a prominent member of its Board of Missions. The alignment of religious and professional virtues was also taken as axiomatic in the French Navy, where Catholicism had a powerful grip on its officer corps. Here, naval service was seen as a religious vocation, and the French man of war as a sort of iron friary adrift in the sea's immensity. However, in the Royal Navy, for Catholics as well as smaller Protestant denominations, their minority status was distinctly problematic. According to the 1913 edition of King's Regulations, on Sundays, all officers and men not on duty were required to attend an Anglican service, unless permission to be absent had been formally obtained on the ground of religious scruples. Though this concession had been enforced from the 1860s, it came with important qualifications. The army had ceased to compel its Catholics to attend Anglican services 50 years earlier, and though Catholics were free to attend services ashore from 1862, it was not until 1908 that Mass was routinely celebrated on board Royal Navy ships, but only in home waters, irregularly still in technical terms, though not, as has sometimes been alleged, for the first time since the reign of James II. In overall terms, the Navy's approach to Catholics was mixed. Though a clergyman's son, Nelson had been tolerant of religious difference, preferring faith of almost any type to Jacobin godlessness. Furthermore, his controversial mistress, Lady Emma Hamilton, seems to have converted to Catholicism after his death. However, such was the cultural conservatism of the Royal Navy at the turn of the 20th century that it seemed as reluctant to grant parity to its religious minorities as it was to commission officers from its lower deck. In this totemic national institution, long after Catholic emancipation and the 1828 repeal of the Test and Corporation Acts, decades after the disestablishment of the Church of Ireland through the Irish Church Act, 1869, and in an era which saw the Monarch Succession Declaration purged of its explicitly anti-Catholic character in 1910, and the Church of England disestablished in nonconformist Wales in 1914, naval service still involved obvious disadvantages for non-Anglicans. For example, before an Order in Council of August 1918 granted temporary commissions as acting chaplains to non-Anglican clergy, only Anglican clergy were eligible to hold a seagoing chaplain's commission. All others served essentially as hired hands. Furthermore, Catholic sailors, who in 1913 represented 9% of the lower deck, whereas 77% were Anglican, never enjoyed the same advantages as their co-religionists in the army. who were not only more numerous at around 15%, but were often concentrated in Irish regiments. Indeed, after more than 2 decades of frustration over the employment of seagoing Catholic chaplains, which had been sanctioned by the Admiralty in 1878, for whenever a squadron would be away for a considerable time from a port where the services of a Roman Catholic priest would be available, but whom squadron commanders routinely forgot to embark, forgot in inverted commas, T.P. O'Connor, MP for Liverpool, Scotland Road, protested in the House of Commons in March 1901 that the Navy's apparent bad faith in this matter amounted to treating the Irish MPs with ignominy and contempt. As Arthur Moore, a former MP, papal count, and a great advocate for the Catholic sailor, put it in an interview with the Irish Daily Independent later that year, the whole thing is left to the caprices of the admiral in command. And such exasperation was justified, for the Navy's position seemed incoherent, inconsistent, and inherently unhelpful, especially at a juncture when Protestant missionary efforts among seafarers and consequent fears of leakage were stoking Catholic interest in the spiritual plight, even vulnerability, of the Catholic sailor. Reflected in the work of the Apostleship of Prayer, the Catholic Truth Society, and the Catholic Letter Guild, the circulation of their publications and correspondence was complemented by the establishment of Catholic sailors' clubs at home and overseas, including a Royal Naval Catholic Club opened at Portsmouth in 1910. In 1892, the Admiralty even approved a substantial devotional manual for the Navy, the Catholic Truth Society's Guide to Heaven for Use of Those at Sea. A pocket-sized book in a navy blue binding, it included dates of movable feast days, a summary of Christian doctrine, the order of Mass, forms of morning and evening prayer, and a brief Sunday morning service for use at sea, which was to be led by a reader, presumably the most senior rank present. It concluded with a selection of 17 hymns, including 3 with a Marian and distinctly maritime flavour. If the guide was emblematic of the wider assertion of ultramontane Catholicism in Navy life, in 1896, 350 officers and men of the Mediterranean fleet were permitted to travel from Civitavecchia to Rome for a papal mass. Given such gestures and concessions, suspicions of Navy caprice were well founded. Since the 1850s, and beginning with Portsmouth, Devonport and Chatham, where the Navy had fitted out chapel hulks, shore-based Catholic clergy had been remunerated for their full and part-time ministries to naval personnel, as a matter of course, and on occasion even before that. But they lacked status, pensions, and even access to Royal Navy ships when in port. From 1901 to 1903, and as Matthew Seligman has shown, surreptitious attempts were made to reconcile naval regulations with Catholic demands by turning a Nelsonian blind eye to those instances where squadron commanders embarked priests who would, inevitably, say Mass on board Royal Navy vessels, in defiance of a ban, restated as recently as 1894, on shipboard services other than those of the Church of England. Beginning with the China station, sufficiently far away in 1901, this subterfuge was even extended to the home fleet for its manoeuvres in August 1903. Although Seligman concluded that this experiment had then been abandoned, it was symptomatic of official duplicity and the slippery nature of the whole issue that, in 1908, and with the assistance of the Benedictine monks of Fort Augustus Abbey, it was revived for the benefit of the home fleet when serving in Scottish waters. Let's turn to anti-Catholicism and the Royal Navy. However irksome and inequitable, it would be hard to claim that this situation was a function of widespread religious bigotry. Although the Navy had played a historic role as the first line of defence against Catholic France and Spain, a role which had led sailors to be prominent in anti-Catholic riots in the 18th century, for example, such was the need for experienced mariners that even in penal times, and in contrast to the army, Catholics had been able to serve on His Majesty's ships. Despite the overwhelming preponderance of Anglicans in the Navy's wardrooms, as the officers' quarters and lower deck, and even the strength of Freemasonry in naval life, Catholic sailors were rarely the subjects of direct discrimination. William Arthur Ford, a Wesleyan Methodist who joined the Navy in 1911 and was promptly put down as Church of England, insisted that, while he rarely came across Catholics, it wouldn't make a difference to us whether a man was a Roman Catholic or atheist or what he was. He was a man to us and a seaman, and if he was a decent sort, that was all that mattered. Religion didn't come into it. There was no animosity between religions. And I wish I had the agricultural burr that Ford put into this. It's a wonderful recording that's available on the Imperial War Museum website. Wonderful. Anyway, ironically, and though it occasioned shrill complaints outside the Navy, the fact that non-Anglicans were allowed to go ashore every Sunday was actually more of a perk than a penalty, and was instrumental in Ford reasserting his own Methodism. Although Seligman has claimed that the lived experience of Catholic sailors on the lower deck is not easy to gauge, it's not irrecoverable. One sailor, for example, lamented in the Apostleship of Prayer's monthly magazine, The Messenger of the Sacred Heart, how neglected Catholic bluejackets were wont to go to the dogs, while another complained that a Catholic priest once told him, "My children were bastards because I was married to a Protestant woman." Another illustration of the depth of sectarianism at this time. Henry Bainham, who compiled the recollections of more than 50 sailors in Men from the Dreadnoughts, published in 1976, noted that while Catholics may have enjoyed more time ashore, being a Catholic was not all gain. As the Maltese were Catholics and were also generally disliked, there was a common joke of stuffing a pillow down your jumper and taking off the fat Maltese priests. Thomas Ives, a Catholic sailor and teetotaler, even recalled how such a prank led to a fight with a drunken messmate. There were, moreover, pockets of marked anti-Catholicism in the higher reaches of the Navy. If the tradition of requiring officers to lead prayer book services in the absence of a chaplain may have deterred more scrupulous Catholics who could not worship publicly with Protestants until the Second Vatican Council, they nonetheless faced what Richard Blake termed the strong Anglican prejudice of naval wardrooms. Besides an innate suspicion born of centuries of British history and Protestant identity, anti-Catholic feeling in the Navy may have been fanned by unionist politics, by the needling character of Catholic self-assertion, by naval Freemasonry, and by the cultural DNA of the service itself. Key individuals could also fuel this sentiment. Although appointed First Naval Lord in 1899 by the First Lord of the Admiralty, a civilian politician, G.J. Goshen, Admiral Lord Walter Kerr was a conspicuous outlier after converting to Catholicism earlier in his career. As the only Catholic admiral in the Navy and a figure who was complicit in the experiment of 1901 to 1903, allowing Mass to be said far afield as it were, his subordinate and successor as First Sea Lord, the ambitious, outspoken and idiosyncratic Anglo-Catholic Sir John Jackie Fisher, was forthright about Kerr's place in a wider web of popish intrigue. In a confidential letter to his friend and ally, the hyper-patriotic journalist Arnold White, Fisher wrote that there's no question whatever about the Roman Catholic influence. It is not realised how the Roman Catholics predominate in our diplomatic service and high places. In the Navy, their one mainstay is Walter Kerr, and they will make him die at his post! As for Kerr himself, whom he conceded to be personally honourable, Fisher fulminated that he is a slave to the Roman Catholic hierarchy and he won't be allowed to leave the Admiralty, however much he may wish it. He is a pervert, and has all the antagonism of the pervert to the faith he has left. As Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet, Fisher objected in principle to the breach of regulations implicit in embarking a Catholic priest, a stand wholly consistent with his later admission that, by taste and conviction, I was a Covenanter, and therefore dead against the Pope. There was, of course, a scattering of Catholic officers in the Navy's wardrooms, while this was illustrated by a poignant list of the dead of the Battle of Jutland, published by the Catholic weekly The Tablet. The Victorian Navy had produced Lieutenant Rudolph Delisle, who proved a keen champion of Catholic sailors before his death while serving with the Naval Brigade in the Sudan at at the Battle of Abu Klea in 1885. Besides taking them to Mass and reading prayers for them on board, as a midshipman, Delisle had boldly and publicly challenged a captain who had mustered Catholic ratings for a Protestant service ashore. Similarly, another Catholic officer, Henry Schomburg Kerr, a veteran of the Crimean War, died in 1895 as a Jesuit priest and missionary in southern Africa. However, Catholics were few in number, and the Edwardian Navy's greatest cause célèbre, one that inspired Terence Rattigan's play The Winslow Boy, 1946, but this is not in the play itself, hinged on the shoddy treatment meted out by the Admiralty to George Archer Shee, a Catholic cadet at the Royal Naval College, Osborne, who was charged with stealing a postal order and expelled in 1908. Although Osborne was a new establishment, opened only 3 years earlier, its ethos combined that of the Royal Navy with that of a great, i.e. Anglican, public school. However, Archer Shee was a square peg in a round hole. He was a Catholic who had arrived at Osborne from Stonyhurst, Britain's leading Jesuit school. Exonerated in the High Court of Justice in 1910 through the advocacy of Sir Edward Carson, there was inevitably a strong suspicion of religious prejudice in the treatment of the accused, with the Catholic weekly The Tablet comparing it unfavourably to that endured by Alfred Dreyfus. One of the moving forces in the high-profile campaign to clear the cadet's name was his half-brother, Martin Archer Shee, a British Army officer decorated in the South African War. Significantly, after his acquittal, George Archer Shee opted for an army career and was killed at Ypres in 1914. If Catholicism sat rather awkwardly in the Royal Navy, long-running history wars, of course we're all familiar with those, also fed rancour in naval affairs, especially when it was erroneously claimed in the Daily Express, where else, in 1913, the 325th anniversary of the Spanish Armada, that the commander of the English fleet, Lord Howard of Effingham, had been a Catholic. This seemingly brazen attempt to appropriate one of the greatest triumphs in English naval history, one that had ensured the survival of Elizabeth I's Protestant regime, was fiercely denounced, with a Mr. Arthur Walsh writing to the newspaper to point out that not only was Lord Howard a good Protestant, but at the time of the Armada, it was a generally recognised fact that it was purely a religious war, and that the object of the Spanish soldiers was to subdue Protestantism and re-establish the Roman Catholic religion. Eventually, the services of the Catholic Duke of Norfolk were recruited to settle the matter, with Howard's descendant confirming that the Lord Admiral, unlike many of his family members, had indeed been a Protestant. Significantly, Arnold White, a virulent anti-Semite and himself no stranger to controversy, observed in a letter to the Duke that the whole matter had fallen prey to the rivalry of extremists in matters of creed and no creed. He also sighed that, "I wish your Grace could see your way to address English and Irish Catholics on the economic aspect of home rule. They would listen to you." Another episode with possible sectarian overtones was the failure by the Admiralty to procure a revolutionary fire control system devised by the polymathic Catholic barrister, businessman, and future chairman of the Tablet, Arthur Pollen. This is where technology and religious prejudice kind of interact, as it were. Distinguished as a well-known naval inventor and writer, Pollen's change-of-range machine, namely the Argo clock, could ensure great accuracy even at extreme range, and Pollen was hailed in the Naval Annual of 1913 as having succeeded in perfecting instruments of incalculable value for long-range gunnery. Even Jackie Fisher described Pollen's invention, initially at least, as simply priceless. Eventually, in 1925, the ingenuity of his device was to be recognised by the Royal Commission on Awards to Inventors. However, Pollen's creation was not adopted by the Royal Navy until after the First World War, rejected in favour of a rival and arguably inferior range-finding system devised by Captain Frederick Dreyer, a naval officer who had also played a part in the procurement process. Although the Admiralty papers concerning the affair were later destroyed, bearing as they did on the often poor results of British gunnery at Jutland, it seems that Pollen, who by all accounts was a difficult partner to work with, was also handicapped by being an Admiralty outsider, a position that his religion and family connections could not have helped. Pollen was the son of John Hungerford Pollen, a notable clergyman and fellow of Merton College who had converted to Catholicism in 1852. Not only that, but Arthur's 8 siblings included 3 priests, 2 Jesuits and an Oratorian, as well as a nun and a naval officer. Never slow to discern signs of Romish intrigue, Fisher, now First Sea Lord, was purposefully uncooperative in the tendering process for Pollen's invention, writing to Arnold White in April 1909, just a day after he had branded his critics in the media as Jews and Jesuits. I have been told that Pollen's ramifications are extraordinary and his newspaper influence very considerable, and his being a Roman Catholic of immense support to him. I have consistently refused to have anything to do with him or see him. Let's turn now to the impact of the war. The outbreak of war in 1914 brought a new urgency to the position of Catholics in the Royal Navy, who were essentially tolerated but indifferently catered for. By 1907, well over 100 Catholic clergy were being remunerated by the Admiralty for their services for Catholic sailors in ports ranging from Chatham to Sydney, New South Wales, but only 2 at Portsmouth and Devonport were solely engaged in a naval ministry. By 1908, this was down to only 1. Over previous decades, the Irish MPs in the House of Commons, who functioned as the parliamentary champions of Catholic interests, had repeatedly voiced their dissatisfaction, being aware, for example, that the provision made by the India Office for Catholic chaplains on troopships bound for India, provision that included the allotment of cabins for religious instruction and hearing confessions. Adding to the parliamentary pressure on the Admiralty in 1901, and against the background of the costly and protracted war in South Africa, a landlocked conflict in which naval gunners had nevertheless been heavily involved, Michael Joyce, MP for Limerick City, argued that if the government wanted Catholic sailors, stokers and marines to man the navy, the least they could do was to provide for the ministrations of their religion. Similarly, William O'Doherty, MP for Donegal North, protested that 7/8 of the vote of £36,000 for navy chaplains went to chaplains belonging to the established Church of England. It was, O'Doherty went on, not so much a question of religion or nationality as of efficiency. He knew in his own constituency of young men who, on account of there being no Catholic chaplains in the Navy, had actually left and joined the American Navy, and so the Empire had lost their services. Besides raising temperatures, such debates exposed how the Navy sought to justify its foot-dragging. Speaking in 1896, the First Lord of the Admiralty, George Goshen, a conservative, a keen churchman, and an ecclesiastical commissioner, alluded to the exclusion of non-Anglican services aboard ship, insisting that Catholic priests serving at sea would require chapels of their own, which were impossible to provide. In 1901, the Parliamentary and Financial Secretary to the Admiralty, the Liberal Unionist H.O. Arnold Foster, MP for West Belfast, even claimed that the Royal Navy merely followed a common pan-European tradition of preventing Catholic chaplains from serving at sea, citing the navies of France, Germany, and even Russia as other examples. Nevertheless, a salutary departure from this supposed norm was provided by the Royal Australian Navy, which came into being in 1911. In 1912, and working from the principle of religious parity rather than naval tradition, a Catholic chaplain was commissioned for service at sea, an arrangement that became permanent in the Australian Navy in February 1914. 6 months later, the outbreak of a major European conflict, the grievances of Catholic Ireland, and the prospect of a bloody and titanic clash with Germany's High Seas Fleet combined to effect a permanent change. Just 3 days into the war, on 7th of August 1914, the Admiralty accepted an offer from the Archbishop of Westminster, Cardinal Francis Bourne, who was acting in his capacity as ecclesiastical superior of Britain's military and naval chaplains, to supply a number of Roman Catholic chaplains for service afloat or in port. The first 4, subsequently 5 appointments were sanctioned by the Treasury, and the appointees embarked for service in each battle squadron of the Home Fleet, with others being nominated for shore duty. However, none of these Catholic chaplains were as yet commissioned. They were under firm instructions as to not holding public services on board ship, and Bourne made his acceptance clear to the Admiralty that what may be done is not to be regarded as a precedent for normal times. However, and as the war at sea unfolded, there was a rising tide of protest over these arrangements. One of the first priests to be appointed for seagoing duty, the Benedictine monk Robert Basil Goodere, was lost on the hospital ship Rahilla, which ran aground off the Yorkshire coast in October 1914. Though Goodere allegedly died while trying to rescue an injured sailor, he should have been serving with a battle squadron of the Grand Fleet rather than on detached duty with this hospital ship. Further losses at sea fed an ingrained sense of Catholic grievance. On 22nd of September, the cruisers Aboukir, Hogue and Cressy were torpedoed by a single German submarine in the North Sea, with the loss of almost 1,500 officers and men. Barely 3 weeks later, the same submarine sank HMS Hawke, a cruiser manned largely by reservists from Ireland, with the loss of another 500. On 1st of November, the Navy sustained another reverse off the coast of Chile, when 2 cruisers, Monmouth and Good Hope, sank with all hands at the Battle of Coronel. Less than a month afterwards, the elderly battleship HMS Bulwark simply blew up at Sheerness, killing over 700. Alarm over such calamitous losses was duly sounded in Catholic circles. On the day of the Battle of Coronel, a letter arrived at the Admiralty from a Thomas J. Lane of Glasgow, who had already taxed the Anglican chaplain of the fleet over the shortage of Catholic naval chaplains. Lane wrote, "Permit me once more to draw your attention to the appalling shortage of Catholic chaplains for Catholic sailors. I am informed by Archdeacon Wood, the chaplain of the fleet, that the appointment of Roman Catholic chaplains for service with the Navy rests in the hands of the Admiralty. If that be so, I would very much like to know who is responsible. The action of the Admiralty in not appointing a sufficient number of Catholic chaplains for service with Catholic sailors in the present hour is a gross insult to Catholics throughout the world. With sinking ships in naval battles and the risk of mines, I wonder if the Admiralty recognise the present need. Perhaps they do not, but I can assure them that every Catholic does." With the proportion of Catholics having now risen to 10% of all naval personnel, the neglect of their needs was also taken up by William Dennehy, the pugnacious editor of the Irish Catholic. And of course it was still largely an Irish question. Catholics comprise 3/4 of Ireland's population of 4.5 million, and most Catholics in England, Scotland and Wales, 6% of their population of 42 million, were of Irish heritage. Prompted by recent losses in November 1914, Dennehy wrote to Sir William Graham Greene, the permanent secretary to the Admiralty, demanding that Catholic sailors be afforded the spiritual consolations and safeguards on which they rely for comfort and security at the hour of death. Greene's response was to claim that the special circumstances of the naval service debar the embarkation of Roman Catholic chaplains in every ship, and no priest was born in the Good Hope and Monmouth, nor on board any of the other vessels named by you. At the same time, it should be observed that none of these vessels were absent from a port where an RC priest is accessible for more than just a short time, and that under modern conditions this is the rule and not the exception. In response, Dennehy tartly inquired why there seemed to be greater difficulty in providing for the accommodation of a Roman Catholic chaplain on board a battleship than there is in the case of a Protestant chaplain, and claimed that there is no reason why a larger number of Roman Catholic chaplains should not now be appointed. He also stressed the ramifications of the present situation. You will of course know that the overwhelming majority of the Catholics serving in the Royal Navy are of Irish birth, and that it is natural that not only the bishops of this country, as expressed in their recent resolutions, but also the general body of the laity feels strongly on the question dealt with in this correspondence. As matters now stand, the result is to limit recruiting for the Royal Navy in Ireland and to arouse feelings of profound anxiety in the minds of the relatives of Irish sailors. The very next day, Dennehy penned a further confidential note concerning the loss of the Bulwark. He wrote, "When replying yesterday, I omitted to state a fact which has come to my knowledge, but which I am sure will convince the Lords Commissioners of the Admiralty of the gravity of the grievance which exists. That is, during the 3 months HMS Bulwark was lying at Sheerness, the Catholic members of the crew were never once able to land in order to attend to their religious duties, while the local clergy were unable to gain access to the ship. In view of the deplorable effect publication of this absolute fact, term which he underlined, would have on opinion in Ireland, I will ask you to regard this communication as an entirely confidential one, solely for their lordships' consideration." While then his claims concerning Bulwark may have been exaggerated, an Admiralty inquiry showed that the Catholic priest at Sheerness stated that every facility was given both for him for visiting the ships and for landing church parties when possible. Dennehy accompanied his lobbying with blaring editorials in the Irish Catholic. Pieces with such inflammatory titles as "No Priest with the Great Fleet," November 1914, and "Ignoring Ireland, How Much Longer," March 1915. This clamour was taken up by other sections of the Catholic press, and the cry of injustice even echoed across the Atlantic, picked up by the Irish-American New York Freeman's Journal. Bad publicity in neutral America, as you'll appreciate. Combined with the anxieties of the Irish hierarchy, concerns expressed in a meeting of the Episcopal Standing Committee in January 1915, the political pressure upon John Redmond MP, leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party and a stalwart supporter of the war effort, became unbearable. Enclosing a copy of the Standing Committee's concerns, Redmond penned an urgent note to Churchill on 22nd of January 1915. "May I ask your serious consideration of the enclosed? It is of very grave importance that something should be done immediately in this matter. The complaint is being used by our enemies everywhere in Ireland. I hope you will send me a reply which I can publish." Another missive followed within a fortnight, after Redmond had received a letter from the Bishop of Waterford and Lismore, Richard Sheehan, complaining that there are a good number of ships which are attended by no chaplain, and further I know of a considerable number of sailors who, after being months in active service, returned home wounded without ever seeing a priest or having had any opportunity of seeing one. By this point, Redmond's correspondence was showing signs of panic. I enclose another letter which I have received from the Bishop of Waterford, who is acting in this matter as secretary to the whole body of bishops. I am extremely uneasy. If a public controversy arises, especially in the House of Commons, it will do untold mischief in Ireland, phrase which he underlined. Pray go into this personally, without any delay. So what concessions and accommodation were made? Churchill proved sympathetic, and not simply on pragmatic grounds. During the reconquest of the Sudan, 1896 to 99, he had been much impressed by the admired Catholic Army chaplain Robert Brindle, later Bishop of Nottingham, and as a war correspondent of the South African War, had drawn some unfavourable comparisons between Brindle and some of his other counterparts. Accordingly, early in March 1915, Churchill shared his views with the Permanent Secretary and the First and Second Sea Lords. He wrote, "It is now shown that there are more than 21,000 Roman Catholics serving in the fleet. I consider, therefore, that during the war there should be a fair proportion of priests afloat. One should be embarked in every battle squadron of 8 ships, and cruiser squadrons should also be provided for. It is a mistake to deal with this question in a narrow and grudging spirit, and we may make it clear that what is permitted in time of war will not bind us in peace. It should be remembered that Catholic sailors are by their religion in special need of ministration at the hour of death." With a curt dismissal of a letter drafted by the Permanent Secretary, one in which the chaplain of the fleet had taken a hand, and which objected to further concessions as they would encourage nonconformists and inflame an unseemly rivalry over shipboard services, Churchill went on, Secretary should rewrite his letter on a more generous basis and not be influenced by the chaplain of the fleet, experience showing that ecclesiastics are apt to be unduly biased. The urgent need for change was not only perceived from Whitehall. As Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Fleet at Scapa Flow, Admiral Sir John Jellicoe also acknowledged the case for accommodation. Despite his credentials as a model churchman, he was highly regarded by the Archbishops of Canterbury and York. His wife was a leading supporter of Anglican naval charities, and his brother was a parish priest in Southampton. Jellicoe did not share the prejudices of Jackie Fisher, and nor, it would seem, the obstinacy of the chaplain of the fleet. Hence, on New Year's Day 1915, he wrote a report to the Admiralty on the situation. This acknowledged the presence of the Grand Fleet's Catholic chaplains on hospital ships, which he said had been dictated by the greater likelihood of their being in harbour, the availability of cabin accommodation, and because they would be on hand to perform the last offices for the sick and wounded. Indeed, it was maintained that Gwydir had been lost because he had specifically asked to remain on Rahilla whilst the ship was detached for the special duty it was serving. There was, Jellicoe also pointed out, a major flaw in the assumption that naval personnel could be simply ferried ashore for church services. This was not the case at Scapa, as it was impracticable on the majority of Sundays on account of weather conditions for ships lying in extensive anchorages during winter months in northern waters to land church parties. Nor do facilities exist at Loch Ewe and Scapa Flow for holding services on shore. For Jellicoe, the solution was glaringly obvious. The prohibition on any public services being conducted on board HM ships for the benefit of officers and men of the Roman Catholic denomination, a ban reiterated as recently as September 1914, simply had to be lifted. A clear, if irregular, precedent to follow lay in the shipboard services that had been allowed since 1908 at Lamlash and Cromarty, where, in the absence of local facilities, the Benedictines of Fort Augustus Abbey had said Mass at weekends on board a selected ship at a convenient time. While this could be extended, officially as a tentative measure, Jellicoe noted that the current situation was in any case patently anomalous. I am not aware of their lordships' reasons for withholding this concession, but it may be because it is considered that it would provide a lever for other sects to make similar demand. This could not be entertained, but as the number of Roman Catholics in the fleet justifies Roman Catholic chaplains being borne afloat, it seems to me a sufficiently powerful reason that they should be permitted to have a service of their own. Despite some haggling over details with the permanent secretary, this renewed momentum was unstoppable, and on Saturday 27th of March 1915, the Irish Catholic reported that a breakthrough meeting had occurred in London between representatives of the Admiralty, including Churchill, Cardinal Bourne, Bishop Sheehan and John Redmond. As the Archbishop of Westminster and the prelate responsible for the supply of Catholic chaplains, Irish or otherwise, to the Army and the Navy, Bourne grandly announced the new arrangements at a St. Patrick's Day reception hosted by Redmond at the Hotel Cecil in London. Reviewing the ad hoc arrangements in place before the war and the appointment of additional chaplains on its outbreak, the Cardinal declared, "The Admiralty has decided to double the number of chaplains in the Grand Fleet, raising them to 10, to appoint an additional chaplain to the Mediterranean Fleet, to send a chaplain, if necessary, to the Eastern Mediterranean, and also to appoint 2 chaplains to the Channel Squadron and 2 to the 10th Cruiser Squadron. In addition, a second whole-time chaplain will be appointed to one of the home bases and 2 to the Royal Naval Division. Thus, 14 additional chaplains have been or will be appointed without delay." This was quite clearly a very substantial augmentation, a large advance in liberality, as even the Irish Catholic conceded, and one that Bourne was prepared to credit the Admiralty for. "It is my duty," he said, "to say that in all these negotiations, which have necessarily extended continuously over a long period, the Admiralty has approached the matter in a most courteous and sympathetic spirit, and I know that throughout the First Lord of the Admiralty, that is Churchill, has desired that the question should be treated in no ungenerous manner." It was, Bourne went on, a complex question from the naval and the ecclesiastical points of view. Moreover, he was gratified that, in reaching this resolution, the Admiralty was prepared to set aside some of the precedents which in the past have rendered a solution even more difficult than it is today. So let's deal finally with the seagoing priests. This arrangement sealed the end of the historic Anglican monopoly over seagoing ministry and shipboard services, even though, for the Navy's other denominations, the work of their clergy remained essentially a shore-based ministry. Its implications were duly itemised in 6 instructions to Roman Catholic priests embarked for duty in HM ships. As this title implied, these were engaged, at least until the summer of 1918, on very different terms from their Anglican counterparts. A seagoing priest would not hold any naval rank, while his duties would comprise saying a low mass at such times and in such places as may be appointed by the captain for this purpose, catechising boy seamen who, if Anglican, were normally confirmed as part of their training, visiting the sick and dying and those in cells and prison, and visiting at convenient times, as may be desirable, those of his people who are employed in other ships and squadrons in which no officiating priest is born. In the execution of his duties, each priest was to be afforded every facility. Cabins were to be made available, transfers from ship to ship were to be arranged, and access given to any hospital ship which may be in company with the squadron to which he is attached. As there could be 2 priests serving with a given fleet or squadron, it was up to the discretion of the senior naval officer present to arrange the order in which each priest shall visit the various ships. For every day employed afloat, an officiating priest would be paid 10 shillings, and he would receive a grant of £10 for the purchase of a portable altar. Unlike commissioned Anglican chaplains, however, there was no entitlement to a pension nor a gratuity at the end of their service. Despite their subaltern status, under this dispensation there was no shortage of officiating priests in the wartime Navy. According to the official history of Royal Navy chaplaincy, 34 were appointed from 1914 to 18, while a 35th entered the service as a commissioned acting chaplain in the final months of the war. In comparison, their shore-bound full-time Church of Scotland and nonconformist equivalents numbered only 13. And as seagoing clergy, several saw action. The Battle of Jutland, 31st of May to 1st of June 1916, was the first time since the Reformation that Catholic chaplains went to battle with the Royal Navy. One of those present, Thomas Bradley, a Redemptorist priest attached to the 1st Battle Cruiser Squadron, which suffered heavily in the battle, seemed forever haunted by the experience, gathering copious notes and newspaper cuttings on that deeply contested encounter. Providentially, as Bradley put it, on the eve of the battle he was occupying the Admiral's spare cabin on HMS Tiger. Otherwise he would have shared the terrible fate of Queen Mary, where he also lived from time to time, and which exploded with the loss of all but 8 of her crew of 1,300. And this is a photograph of the Queen Mary exploding at Jutland. Among the 6,000 British dead was another officiating priest, namely Stuart Phelan of the 1st Cruiser Squadron, who died on HMS Black Prince, along with its entire complement of 860. The increased presence and enhanced recognition of Catholicism in the Navy proved a natural source of satisfaction for British Catholics. In 1916, an officiating priest with the Grand Fleet described how Easter had been marked that year. Delayed due to patrolling in the North Sea, the celebration took place on return to harbour, with a hymn proving so catchy that he later heard it whistled on the mess decks and hummed in the wardroom. Furthermore, and following visits to the Grand Fleet by the Archbishop of York in July 1915, and this is the Archbishop of York visiting the Grand Fleet, and the Bishop of London in July 1916, in August 1916, Cardinal Bourne travelled to its anchorage at Scapa Flow. Here he celebrated Mass, administered confirmation, blessed the naval cemetery, dined with Jellicoe, was introduced to naval gunnery, and, so his secretary claimed, became the first English cardinal to visit the fleet since Cardinal Stewart, the last of the Stewart line, stayed with Nelson in the Mediterranean. In January 1917, as part of his visit to Rome, Bourne presented 80 British sailors to Pope Benedict XV and paid a 2-day visit to Royal Navy ships anchored at the Italian port of Taranto. Still, this assertiveness was not necessarily welcomed, especially as, apart from individual prejudice, it imposed new obligations on those in command and undermined naval tradition. That hostility could be voiced quite openly was evident from the career of Arthur Pollen's sibling, Anthony Pollen, a priest of the Birmingham Oratory, who went to sea as an officiating priest in 1915. Reporting to the newly completed £2.5 million battleship HMS Warspite, Pollen came face to face with Captain Edward Montgomery Philpotts, the son of an archdeacon and the grandson of a bishop, who in July 1916 was also identified by the Bishop of London as the brother of one of his old curates in Bethnal Green. Coolly appraising his new shipmate, Philpotts announced that, "I hope we shall get on, but I think it fair to tell you that I don't like Catholics." To which Pollen replied, "I am sure, sir, that we shall get on. As to be candid, I detest Protestants." The stir that the advent of a seagoing priest could create was captured by Montague Thomas Haines-Sellin, Anglican chaplain of the battleship HMS Ajax. On the arrival of a new Catholic colleague, he wrote, "Some of our men were a little exercised in mind as to how the two rivals would get on together." At last, on being asked directly what he was going to do about it, Haines-Sellin replied that the following Sunday, instead of the usual service, we had arranged to have a 10-round contest without gloves to settle the conflicting claims of the Anglican and Roman Catholic churches once and for all. Friction was also anticipated when Thomas Caspars, chaplain of the cruiser HMS Antrim, found himself hospitalised with a Roman Catholic chaplain who belonged to the Order Redemptoris, which is almost certainly Bradley, in the winter of 1915-16. As Caspars remarked, the other patients tried to involve us in a Catholic versus Protestant battle, but we refused to be drawn. However, some relationships were from the outset marked by cordiality and cooperation. Of the Dardanelles campaign of 1915-16, the Anglican Navy chaplain Henry Clapham Foster, who served ashore with the Royal Naval Division, wrote, "In Gallipoli there were chaplains for Anglicans and Roman Catholics, and it is pleasant to record that we lived together in godly union and concord. In the face of major agreements, we could afford to forget minor differences. There was no throwing away of principles, but a keen desire on the part of all chaplains to be friends, however greatly they might differ from one another." According to the Oblate Missionary Record of 1916, Stuart Phelan found the Protestant chaplain, William Webber of Black Prince, well accustomed to all the ways of the sea, and a shipmate who was most helpful and kind from the very beginning. Similarly, while the ill-fated Queen Mary had the distinction of being the Navy's first modern battleship to incorporate a purpose-built chapel, being unconsecrated, it was also available for Catholic use. Hence, while Bradley heard confessions in its band instrument room, he said Mass in the chapel using the opposite end to the Church of England altar. There was also a mellowing in other quarters. With the support of Commander Francis Hodgson, the Catholic navigating officer of the Warspite, space for a second Catholic chaplain was secured, one which Hodgson described as the best and most devotional chapel afloat in the fleet. Furthermore, and despite the verbal duelling which had marked their first encounter, Philpotts and Pollen were both keen golfers, and so often played around together on the 18-hole course built by the Grand Fleet at Scapa. More poignantly, Thomas Collins, an engine room artificer on Warspite, witnessed the encounter between Pollen and Walter Carey, its Anglican chaplain and a future Bishop of Bloemfontein, at Rosyth just after Jutland. Both had distinguished themselves in the battle, Carey by fighting fires below deck and administering first aid to badly burned sailors, Pollen by rescuing the occupants of a blazing turret, earning a Distinguished Service Cross in the process. As he was not a commissioned officer, Jellicoe judged Pollen ineligible for the Distinguished Service Order, though this went later to Stephen Thornton, a Catholic chaplain serving with the Royal Naval Division. Anyway, as Collins recollected from Warspite, after the dead had all been carried ashore, it was now the turn of the wounded. I was standing beside the Reverend Walter Carey at this time, and a stretcher was being carried past with the body completely swathed in bandages, with only holes for mouth, nose and eyes. As the stretcher passed, we heard a voice saying, "God bless Warspite," and recognised it as that of Father Pollen, who was badly burned trying to save men in the fire. Carey broke down and wept like a child. So the conclusion. In October 1925, Admiral of the Fleet Earl Jellicoe Escapa performed the opening ceremony of the new club for Catholic seamen at the Sailors' Home, Canning Place, Liverpool. Although Jutland had diminished his stature, and neither had he shone in his subsequent role as First Sea Lord, Jellicoe's stock among Catholic seafarers remained high. As the tablet reported, Seaman J. O'Neill proposed that this meeting, representative of the Catholics of Liverpool, record their thanks for his constant interest in the Catholic men of the Navy. It was due to this interest on the part of his lordship that our Catholic Navy men were granted religious services on board, and that later Catholic chaplains were permanently appointed to the Navy. That motion being seconded, Father Blundell, on behalf of the Catholic chaplains, spoke feelingly in support of it. After the resolution had been carried, with cheers, Earl Jellicoe, in reply, thanked the meeting. As a senior officer, he had always realised, he said, that the material and religious good of his men was his chief concern, and he was glad to think that he had been of service to them. But these cordial exchanges ignored larger realities. Despite reference to the permanency of Catholic naval chaplaincy, under the terms of a further order in council of October 1922, Catholic priests were designated temporary Roman Catholic chaplains and did not gain parity with their Anglican counterparts until November 1943, 2 decades and another world war later. Furthermore, the cause of Catholicism in the Navy, especially when championed by Catholic Irish nationalists, had laid bare historic religious and ethnic cleavages within the British Isles, illustrating at the heart of the British Empire and the fulcrum of British sea power the numerous and intractable fractures of a multi-religious empire. Thank you.